저는 북한 공산
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces.
You know I'm cold, but I'm hot, got a fever. You been tryst in the cross 2 litre. We got yay, come fluffy like a bunny. Blood on my Da Vinci teeth, nose running. I'm with buckshot, summertime driving. Hot outside, so we gotta keep the top off. Up now, but you know I still bust shots. High grade, till I wait, then the cops up.
Swear to God, I live in kick boss moments. Had it in my hands, but I football when I hold it. Under city lights, moving out of frame. West Village bitch, but you won't do the same. Nose too sharp, skin stay side. Breath too slow from a long last night. Heart too fast, and the chest gets tight. Crying out my name with tears in her eyes.
Cute for the 50, 25 8. She cute and she miss me, calling me babe. But I don't got time, bitch, I'm married to the game. Fast life, man, I'm loving this game.
Every leap of faith I fall, fade away to the curtain call. I found God in the bathroom stall. Forgive me sins for the same or wrong.
You know I'm cold, but I'm hot, got a fever. You been tryst in the cross 2 litre. We got yay, come fluffy like a bunny. Blood on my Da Vinci teeth, nose running. I'm with buckshot, summertime driving. Hot outside, so we gotta keep the top off. Up now, but you know I still bust shots. High grade, till I wait, let me cop some. You know I'm cold, but I'm hot, got a fever. You been tryst in the cross 2 litre. We got yay, come fluffy like a bunny. Blood on my Da Vinci teeth, nose running. I'm with buckshot, summertime driving. Hot outside, so we gotta keep the top off. Up now, but you know I still bust shots. High grade, till I wait.
Good dog, no gimmicks. I'm so high, calm in the city. Let's take a life full of whiskey pills. Deer on the dress, I got blood on the bills. Up down sideways, but I'm falling backwards. Pop a painkiller, oxycodone with a Xanax. I was on the wrong ways, I was out of Paris. Now I don't even leave the house, I'm embarrassed.
You know I'm cold, but I'm hot, got a fever. You been tryst in the cross 2 litre. We got yay, come.
December 3rd, 2024, is a day that will live in infamy. No, I'm just kidding. It won't live in infamy, at least for people outside of the Republic of Korea. However, if you are Korean, you're likely familiar with this date, or at least the events that transpired in and after December 2024. On December 3rd, 2024, then President Yoon Suk-yeol would unexpectedly declare martial law, plunging the small country into political turmoil. Even a year later, the long specter of President Yoon's decree has haunted the Korean peninsula, sending shockwaves across their political and cultural landscape. And just when it felt like that chapter of Korean politics was beginning to close, Yoon Suk-yeol's name has re-entered the public consciousness, as a high court recently ruled on his outstanding cases. Yoon Suk-yeol, sentenced to life for his questionable martial law decree, has become a symbol of how fragile South Korea's political order remains. However, Yoon didn't emerge out of nowhere. His decision to embark martial law was subtly foreshadowed not only up until the day of, but was the endpoint of a long political and personal trajectory. To understand this, we have to rewind far before December 2024. We have to look at who Yoon Suk-yeol was before the presidency, how he was shaped, who he aligned with, and what kind of political worldview he carried into office. Because although the crisis began on December 3rd, it was decades in the making. Today, I will be looking into and providing an in-depth retrospective of the 2024 South Korean martial law crisis. Based on hours of extensive research and planning that I've done, I will unpack every aspect of this historic moment, while providing my first-hand account and commentary of the events, as someone who lived in South Korea while this unfolded. I will also give my final judgment on the disgraced former president. Was he wrong in declaring martial law? This video was months in the making and was by far my most laborious to film and conceive. If you enjoy, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And without further ado, let's begin. To understand the 2024 martial law crisis, you first have to understand the man who triggered it. Yoon was born in 1960 in Seoul into an elite, academically successful family. His father was a professor of economics educated in Japan during the colonial period and later involved in Korean academia after liberation. Yoon attended some of South Korea's top schools, among those including Chungham High School in Seoul. This will be an important detail later. He eventually entered Seoul National University, one of the country's most prestigious universities, part of the Sky Trio. Unlike many of his contemporaries who gravitated toward activism during South Korea's democratization movements of the 1980s, following military dictatorships, Yoon largely stayed outside of the student protest culture that opposed these. After passing the notoriously difficult Korean bar exam, Yoon entered the prosecution service, one of the most powerful institutions in South Korea. Yoon built his reputation as an aggressive instigator early in his career. He gained attention for investigating corruption cases involving powerful business figures and the country's political elites. Now, his major breakthrough came during the downfall of former President Park Geun-hye in 2016. Yoon was one of the top prosecutors who investigated Park's corruption scandal, which eventually led to her impeachment and imprisonment. This moment catapulted him into national prominence. Ironically, this moment later planted the seeds for Yoon's political transformation. The impeachment of Park Geun-hye was not just a legal event, it was also a mass political mobilization that overthrew a conservative president and sparked a nationwide anti-corruption campaign. Now, millions of Koreans protested in the streets during this time. Yoon, however, experienced this moment from within the prosecutorial apparatus, as he was one of the Korean elites. His victory was institutional, and while the trial of Park Geun-hye was seen as proof of a righteous, democratic justice, Yoon didn't exactly emerge as a democratic reformer like some of his other colleagues. He emerged as a symbol of the prosecutor as a political force. Under then-President Moon Jae-in, Yoon was appointed Prosecutor General in 2019. This was supposed to be a reformist appointment. Moon's administration wanted to reduce the power of prosecutors and rebalance the justice system. Now, instead, Yoon turned into one of Moon's fiercest institutional adversaries. He resisted reforms that would have weakened prosecutorial authority, and he also oversaw investigations into Moon's allies and other family members of his. His then resignation as Prosecutor General in 2021 transformed him not only into a political martyr for the conservatives who saw Moon's government as undermining traditional power structures. Yoon was suddenly useful to the South Korean right wing because he embodied institutional resistance to the ever-sweeping liberal reform of the DPK. Now, I want to make something clear. From here on out, I will be referencing the two major parties in Korea as the PPP, People's Power Party, and the DPK, Democratic Party of Korea, which are essentially the Korean equivalent to Republicans and Democrats, respectively. Just something to keep in mind. But nevertheless, when Yoon entered politics, he did so without a super deep policy platform. He had no strong grassroots base. He did not have a long history of party organizing. The thing that he had was he had institutional credibility, an elite network, and a public image that he had built on political confrontation. His presidential campaign in 2022 leaned heavily on culture war themes, hostility to feminism, and a law and order rhetoric, so forth, similar to Trumpism. He appealed to disaffected young men, conservative voters, who were resentful of continuing a progressive change, and those looking for a harder stance on China and North Korea, whom many had criticized the former president, Moon Jae-in, for attempting to mend relations with. Running in 2022 for president, Yoon's victory was narrow, which is an important factor. This would later set the groundwork for his declaration of martial law. He entered office without a strong popular mandate and an opposition-controlled National Assembly, which is effectively the legislative body. This created a structural problem. Yoon saw himself as the legitimate guardian of state authority, but he lacked any serious legislative power. Instead of building coalitions or negotiating with the parliament, he increasingly relied on executive power, prosecutors, and the existing security institutions to govern around the Korean legislature, sort of similar to a lame duck president. This governing style did harden over time, however, as Yoon surrounded himself with former prosecutors, security officials, and loyalists from the elite institutions of Korea. The opposition to Yoon eventually became increasingly paranoid with his consort of advisors, such as the then Chief of Presidential Security Service, Kim Yong-hyun, Interior Minister Lee Sang-min, and Capital Defense Command Chief Lee Jin-woo. Now, I want you to remember when I previously mentioned that Yoon attended Chungam High School in Seoul. So did all of the three previously mentioned top members of his cabinet. In Korea, this alliance was dubbed the Chungam faction by the opposition to Yoon, and his favoritism of high school alumni did draw stark criticism. He had nominated a cabinet of fiercely loyal childhood friends, essentially, but his administration had repeatedly also clashed with labor unions, journalists, and opposition lawmakers. He continued to frame the dissent within not only the opposition party, but within his own as obstruction or subversion of governmental processes. Now, rumors did begin floating that a declaration of martial law may be coming prior to its decree. There were some serious and also acute warning signs that the idea of martial law had been floating around inside Yoon's inner circle long before December 2024. According to testimony later given under prosecution questioning, Yoon began talking privately about emergency measures as early as late 2023. Now remember, martial law was in December 2024. At the time, these comments were vague, framed as a response to difficult social issues. But in hindsight, these were obviously early warning signals. Now, by March 2024, the conversation had become explicit. Yoon invited several top security officials to a private dinner. The then Defense Minister, Shin Won-sik, National Intelligence Service Director Cho Tae-yong, and the Presidential Security Chief Kim Yong-hyun. During that dinner, Yoon reportedly told them he was considering declaring martial law. However, not everyone in the room agreed. Shin and Cho both pushed back. They warned that martial law would be disastrous politically, legally, and socially. Shin, in particular, was so alarmed by what he heard that he immediately reached out to Kim Yong-hyun and counterintelligence chief Yo In-hyung afterward to discuss how to block any such move if Yoon tried to push it forward. Now, this internal resistance would be extremely short-lived. After Yoon's party suffered a major defeat in the April 2024 legislative elections, essentially midterm elections, his rhetoric reportedly shifted. According to Yo In-hyung, his counterintelligence chief, Yoon began referencing martial law more frequently after the loss, as his legislative losses increasingly piled up. In the months that followed, the internal balance of power inside Yoon's administration changed. Shin Won-sik was quietly moved out of the defense ministry role and reassigned to a national security advisory role. In his place, Yoon installed Kim Yong-hyun, his closest loyalist and a member of the Chungam faction. As new Minister of National Defense, later court filings would reveal that Yoon met with Kim Yong-hyun, Yo In-hyung, and other key security officials roughly 10 times throughout 2024, leading up to December to discuss martial law scenarios. Now, years before any of this unfolded, however, Yoon had already revealed a certain affection with authoritarian figures. In 2021, long before becoming president, he had made remarks praising the former military dictator of South Korea, Chun Doo-hwan, describing Chun's legacy as something that many Koreans viewed positively, except for the coup and the Gwangju massacre. Inside Yoon's inner circle, the nostalgia for past authoritarians went even further. Kim Yong-hyun, one of the central figures in the Chungam faction, which I previously mentioned, had reportedly joked that protests and opposition could simply be swept away by a martial law decree. Later reporting and testimony would surface claims about Kim's fascination with literature such as Mein Kampf, details that intensified public suspicion that this circle wasn't just tactically authoritarian or in layman's terms for the purpose of advancing Yoon's political agenda, but extremely comfortable with this sort of state power. By mid-2024, opposition lawmakers began publicly warning that martial law was being prepared behind closed doors. They pointed to Yoon's language about anti-state forces, something he would later use as his defense for martial law and his consolidation of power within a tight loyalist network, as well as a sudden reshuffling of security leadership as red flags. Now, ultimately, these warnings were dismissed by Yoon's party as conspiracy theories. The presidential office denied any involvement in such plans or matters. Now, internally, preparations were already underway. Documents brought to light in court later revealed the military counterintelligence units were drafting martial law scenarios. Meetings were being held between senior intelligence officers and military police commanders, and even fast food restaurants became back rooms for operational discussions of martial law. And for those who aren't aware, South Korea has a long and controversial history of leaders using emergency powers to crush political dissent. In the past, defense ministers and generals have played key roles in coups and crackdowns. From Syngman Rhee's overthrowing as president to the violence of Gwangju, where in the 1980s Korean military members killed like 100 anti-government protesters. Yoon's inner circle was not really ignorant or dismissive of this, however, at least internally. In fact, some of the documents used in planning of Yoon's martial law echoed contingency plans written during the Park Geun-hye impeachment years earlier, including scenarios involving military deployment to suppress protests and prevent lawmakers from overturning a martial law. By the time December 2024 arrived, as you can see, the events that followed were the endpoint of a very long process. On December 3rd, 2024, Yoon would launch the state into an objective period of political chaos. After a great deal of research and digging, here is the official timeline of the events that transpired in South Korea on December 3rd, 2024. Now, for the sake of continuity, all of the following take place in Korean Standard Time. Here is the official martial law timeline. December 3rd, at 22:23 Korean Standard Time, Yoon Suk-yeol would begin making his martial law declaration. At 22:27, Yoon Suk-yeol would declare martial law in South Korea. At 22:28, Defense Minister Kim would give an order to the DCC Commander Lieutenant General Yoon Hyung and gave him a target list of Korean politicians and opposition members to arrest. The target list would include the Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung, National Assembly Speaker Woo Son-sik, People's Power Party leader Han Dong-hoon, Democratic Party Representative Kim Min-sok, Democrat Party Floor Leader Park Chan-dae, National Assembly Legislation and Judiciary Committee Chair Jung Chung-rae, Rebuilding Korea Party Leader Cho Kook, liberal journalist Kim Woo-jun, former Supreme Court Chief Justice Kim Young-soo, Kim Min-woong, brother of Rep. Kim Min-sok, and leader of the Candlelight Movement and former National Election Commission Chairman Kwon Soon-il. At 22:30, Kim Yong-hyun addressed the video conference giving an order to all military commanders. At 22:30, Yoon Suk-yeol would direct Interior Minister Lee to shut off power and water to 5 media organizations. At 22:40, Police Commissioner Cho Ji-ho received a call from DCC Commander Yoon Hyung to help track locations of those on target list for arrest. Armed troops would raid the National Election Commission HQ in Gwacheon and Suwon in the Gyeonggi Province. Also, National Election Survey Deliberation Committee in the Gwanak District. At 22:50, Lee Jae-myung begins live streaming on his YouTube channel, urging citizens to gather at the National Assembly building. At 22:53, Yoon Suk-yeol would call NIS, the National Intelligence Service, and the director, Hong Jong-won, and ordered to help DCC arrest his political opponents and use this chance to wipe them out. That's a quote. At 2300, Lee Jae-myung would live stream himself climbing over National Assembly fence. At 2304, Seoul Metropolitan Police would block all entrances to the National Assembly, preventing lawmakers from forming a plenary session. At 2325, Martial Law Commander Army General Park An-soo issued the following decree. which retroactively took effect at 2300. The following the decree states as follows: all political activities, including activities of the National Assembly, local council, political parties, and political association, rallies, and demonstrations are prohibited. Number 2, all acts that deny or attempt to overthrow the free democratic system are prohibited. The dissemination of fake news, manipulation of public opinion, and false propaganda are prohibited. All media and publications are subject to the control of martial law command. Number 4, strikes, work stoppages, and rallies that incite social chaos are prohibited. Number 5, trainee doctors and all other medical personnel who are on strike or have left their work sites must return to their positions within 48 hours and work faithfully. Those who violate the order will face punishment in accordance with the Martial Law Act. Number 6, innocent ordinary citizens, including anti-state forces and other subversive forces, will be subject to measures to minimize inconvenience in their daily lives. At 2350, military helicopters were seen approaching the National Assembly grounds, prompting lawmakers and aides to build furniture barricades inside. Now, December 4th, at 040, President Yoon Suk-yeol would order Commander Kwak Jong-gun and Capitol Defense Commander Lee Jin-woo to break through the plenary chamber doors to drag the lawmakers out. At around 045, around 300 military personnel entered the National Assembly building, broke windows, and attempted to enter the main hall, where Speaker Woo Won-sik was about to begin the plenary session to revoke the martial law decree. In response, staff sprayed them with fire extinguishers and successfully stopped their entry. Some soldiers attempted to enter through the 4th floor, but were stopped by employees. At 048, National Assembly commences the emergency session. At 050, President Yoon Suk-yeol ordered Commander Kwak Jong-gun and Capitol Defense Commander Lee Jin-woo to break through the plenary chamber doors to drag the lawmakers out. At 102, 190 of 300 lawmakers vote unanimously to lift the martial law. 172 opposition MPs and 18 members of a PPP faction ran by Han Dong-hoon, Speaker Woo Seon-wi would call for the military and police to leave the assembly as declaration of extraordinary martial law is now void. He was also reiterating that the president did not notify the National Assembly on implementing martial law as prescribed in the Constitution. At 118, soldiers begin withdrawing. At 427, Yoon Suk-yeol announces he is lifting the martial law. At 430, Cabinet approved the motion to lift martial law. At 554, plenary session adjourned after confirmation that martial law had ended.
당시에 있었던 그러한 그 민족적 감정의 발로라 이렇게 보는 것입니다.
When President Yoon Suk-yeol lifted martial law in the early hours of December 4th, 2024, the crisis was far from over. The martial law declaration was only the spark of the firestorm of political chaos that would follow. Within hours of the declaration and reversal, the Inspector General of the Ministry of Justice, Ryu Hyuk, that was a tough one, resigned in protest. Ryu had attended a meeting convened by Justice Minister Park Sung-jae regarding the implementation of martial law and stepped down almost immediately afterward. Dozens of presidential aides resigned en masse in the early morning of December 4th, creating an immediate leadership vacuum inside the Korean presidential office. On that same day, the Supreme Court of Korea announced that it would begin examining the legality of the declaration, citing possible violations of mandatory constitutional procedures, including the failure to properly notify the Cabinet and National Assembly in advance. On December 6, 2024, the Constitutional Court of Korea formally opened its own inquiry into whether Yoon's declaration violated Article 77 of the Constitution, which governs the conditions and procedures for martial law. Now, politically, Yoon's own party fractured almost immediately following martial law. On December 4th, leadership figures within the ruling People's Power Party, PPP, openly discussed whether Yoon should be expelled from the party. PPP leader Han Dong-hoon, who, as you remember, was one of the names on Yoon's target list, publicly urged Yoon to dismiss Minister of National Defense Kim Yong-hyun, identifying Kim as the official who had proposed the declaration of martial law. Han would later state that he had privately requested Yoon's withdrawal from the party through both Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and other senior presidential officials. Now, the opposition party, the DPK, moved just as quickly. On December 5th, 2024, DPK leaders announced that impeachment motions would be filed against President Yoon Suk-yeol, Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun, and Minister of the Interior and Safety Lee Sang-min, if Yoon did not resign effective immediately. That same day, Kim Yong-hyun publicly apologized for the deployment of troops and accepted responsibility for the actions of the armed forces in Korea. Yoon accepted Kim's resignation later that day. In subsequent media interviews, Kim admitted that troops were sent to the National Election Commission to assess the necessity of investigating alleged election fraud. A justification the commission itself condemns as a violation of the Constitution and an unlawful incursion into an independent constitutional body. On December 4th at noon, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo convened an emergency meeting with remaining cabinet members and party leadership to manage the fallout. Han Duck-soo had publicly apologized to the nation and stated that he bore responsibility as the head of government for what had occurred. On December 4th, 2024, every major South Korean newspaper, bear with me with these names, including Chosun Ilbo, Jungon Ilbo, Hankyoreh, and Donga Ilbo, all of which vary in political affiliation, issued editorials condemning Yoon's actions and calling for his immediate arrest. This signaled not only dissent from the opposition, but also from the conservative wing of the party against Yoon's actions. The National Union of Media Workers denounced the declaration as illegal and historically regressive. Major cultural figures and entertainers publicly condemned the president, Yoon Suk-yeol. Religious institutions, including the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Korea, the Korean Methodist Church, and the National Council of Churches in Korea, as well as the Won Buddhist Order, issued formal statements condemning the declaration and calling for accountability. On December 4th, 370 professors and researchers from Korea University signed a joint declaration demanding Yoon's impeachment. Public outrage intensified over the wording of Article 5 of the martial law decree, which used the term chodan, a term in Korean which is widely considered to mean execution. The backlash even extended to Yoon's personal networks. The Chungam High School Foundation publicly condemned both Yoon as well as the rest of the Chungam faction, including Kim Yong-hyun, as shameful graduates. The school suspended its uniform requirements after students in Korea were harassed in public, and the student council even issued a statement supporting impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol. Within the Korean National Assembly, the situation had exploded into a constitutional crisis. On December 4th, opposition lawmakers from 6 parties submitted an impeachment motion against Yoon. On December 7th, the first impeachment vote failed due to a boycott by most PPP lawmakers. Public anger then exploded. Petitions calling for the dissolution of the PPP surpassed 170,000 signatures within days. PPP leader Han Dong-hoon later reversed course, stating on December 6th that Yoon should be suspended from duties to protect the Republic of Korea. By December 14th, 2024, the National Assembly voted 204 for, 85 against to impeach President Yoon. This included 12 votes from PPP lawmakers. His presidential powers were then suspended immediately upon delivery of the resolution to the presidential office, and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo became the acting president of Korea. Happening parallel to these events, the Korean legal system began dismantling Yoon's inner circle. On December 8th, 2024, former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun was formally arrested on suspicion of insurrection, accused of advising Yoon to declare martial law and ordering troops into the National Assembly. The Ministry of Justice imposed an overseas travel ban on Kim after reports surfaced that he had attempted to flee the country. On December 9th, the same ministry imposed an overseas travel ban on Yoon Suk-yeol himself, marking the first time a sitting South Korean president had faced such harsh restrictions. Between December 10th and December 17th, police and joint investigation teams raided, and this is a long, comprehensive list, so bear with me, the Presidential Office, the Defense Counterintelligence Command, the Capitol Defense Command, the Army Special Warfare Command, the National Police Agency, the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency, and the Presidential Security Service. Senior officials were arrested in rapid succession. Cho Ji-ho, the Commissioner General of the National Police Agency, Lee Jin-woo, Commander of the Capitol Defense Command, Yoon Hyung, Chief of the Defense Counterintelligence Command, Kwak Jong-gun, Commander of the Army Special Warfare Command, Park Un-soo, Chief of Staff of the Republic of the Korea Army. The National Assembly then passed special council legislation on December 10th and December 12th, creating permanent investigative bodies to pursue treason and insurrection charges against Yoon and his fellow collaborators. The National Archives of Korea issued formal preservation orders to prevent the destruction of evidence across all government agencies. Then, on December 10th, 2024 at 11:52 p.m., former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun attempted suicide while in police detention, using his clothing to try to hang himself in a bathroom at the detention facility. The Ministry of Justice confirmed the attempt and placed Kim under protective supervisions. 2 weeks later, on December 27th, Kim was formally indicted on insurrection charges. By early 2025, the South Korean state was prosecuting its own executive branch, essentially, engulfing not only the presidency, but the cabinet, the military, the police, and the intelligence services in an overlapping criminal and constitutional investigation. Yoon's martial law decree had failed spectacularly. The fallout would continue into 2025 and would only come to an ignominious end in February 2026. On January 14th, 2025, the Constitutional Court of Korea convened the first hearing of Yoon's impeachment trial to determine whether he would be permanently removed from office. The hearing was immediately adjourned because Yoon had failed to appear. The next morning, on January 15th, investigators from the Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranking Officials, or CIO, because that's a mouthful, executed an arrest warrant at Yoon's presidential residence, where he had been holed up since the impeachment vote. Officers then used wire cutters and ladders to bypass barricades and barbed wire fortifications erected by the Presidential Security Service. Yoon was then arrested on site and transported to CIO headquarters for interrogation, once again making history by being the first sitting president in South Korean history to be arrested. The arrest of Yoon Suk-yeol triggered immediate unrest. On January 18th, 2025, Yoon's supporters clashed with police outside the Seoul Western District Courthouse, and some even stormed the courthouse after the court approved an extension of Yoon's detention. On January 21st, Yoon appeared before the Constitutional Court for the first time. There, he denied ordering the military or police to obstruct lawmakers during the National Assembly's vote to lift the martial law. 2 days later, on January 23rd, the CIO formally recommended that Yoon be charged with leading an insurrection and an abuse of power. Now, that same day, Yoon appeared again before the Constitutional Court, where former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun testified as a witness. Kim denied that Yoon had ordered troops to storm the National Assembly, but he did admit that he personally recommended martial law and drafted a note to Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok, instructing the creation of an emergency legislative body under martial law. Kim had also acknowledged discussions about forcibly removing lawmakers from the chamber. He later framed his comments as an attempt to reduce the risk of people being crushed, rather than to suppress parliamentary authority. On January 26, 2025, Yoon was formally indicted on charges of insurrection. Now, his criminal case was assigned to the Criminal Collegiate Division 25 of the Seoul Central District Court, which is the same division handling all martial law related prosecutions against Kim Yong-hyun, Cho Ji-ho, and Kim Bong-si. Now, immediately after, Yoon's defense team moved to cancel his detention on February 4th. However, the court rejected this request. The first preparatory hearing of the criminal trial was then held on February 20th, 2025, under heavy security following the previous courthouse riot. That same day, during a constitutional court session, Yoon's legal team argued that the declaration of martial law was intended as a warning to the public about legislative obstruction. Now, Acting Chief Justice Moon Hyung-bae then scheduled subsequent hearings for February 25 and March 24th as the impeachment trial continued in parallel with the criminal proceedings. On February 25th, 2025, Yoon then issued a public apology during the final day of the impeachment trial. However, he did continue to defend the declaration of martial law as a legitimate act of executive governance. The impeachment proceedings concluded after 11 hearings over 73 days with 16 witnesses testifying. Legal counsel for the National Assembly compared Yoon's conduct to the authoritarian practices of Park Chung-hee and Chun Do-hwan, who were both military dictators who came to power during the early decades of Korean democracy. This characterized the martial law declaration as a form of dictatorship, essentially. Yoon, of course, rejected that framing, claiming he never intended to impose full military rule, and once again argued that his actions were meant to warn the nation about what he described as legislative abuse by the opposition. While the impeachment trial concluded, the criminal case only deepened. On March 8, 2025, Yoon was released from the Seoul Detention Center after prosecutors declined to appeal a court decision canceling his detention. The DPK condemned the decision and called for the resignation of Prosecutor General Shim Woo-jung, accusing the prosecution of showing improper leniency towards Yoon. The constitutional process then reached its climax on April 4th, 2025. In a televised ruling delivered by Acting Chief Justice Moon Young-bae, the Constitutional Court of Korea unanimously voted 8-0 to uphold Yoon's impeachment, which permanently removed him from the office of president. The court ruled that Yoon had committed serious violations of the Constitution and the Martial Law Act, including declaring martial law without meeting substantive legal requirements, violating procedural requirements by bypassing the cabinet and failing to notify the National Assembly, ordering military and police forces to interfere with the National Assembly's constitutional authority to lift martial law, directing intelligence officials to track political opponents for potential arrest, deploying troops for political purposes in violation of military neutrality, infringing on citizens' political rights and freedoms, authorizing warrantless raids on the National Election Commission, and pressuring judicial independence by tracking the locations of former justices. Upon delivery of the verdict at 11:22 a.m. Korean Standard Time, Yoon ceased to be president. This triggered a presidential election within 60 days and stripped him of all presidential immunity. Now, with immunity gone, prosecutors moved forward extremely aggressively. On April 14th, 2025, Yoon's insurrection trial began. Now, it's important to take a sidebar to talk about what else occurred during this period from April to June in South Korea, because the court had ruled unanimously to uphold Yoon's impeachment. Now, this triggered a snap presidential election. The government had set the date of the election for June 3rd, 2025. As the small nation braced for its most consequential election in decades, two major fault lines emerged early in the campaign: legal eligibility and foreign policy orientation. Now, at the head of the opposition slate was Lee Jae-myung. He was the nominee of the DPK. Lee's candidacy and legitimacy were immediately jeopardized from the start by his own legal troubles. Legal troubles will become a recurring theme in Korea. Under the Public Official Election Act, individuals fined more than 1 million won face a 5-year ban on public offense, and those with a prison sentence can be barred for 10 years. Lee had been given a suspended prison sentence by a lower court, but on March 23rd, 2025, the Seoul High Court reversed that decision, conveniently restoring his eligibility to run. Now, despite that reprieve, Lee's candidacy was thrown back into legal uncertainty on May 2nd, 2025, when the Supreme Court fast-tracked a deliberation and overturned his acquittal, sending the case back to the Seoul High Court for retrial, a process usually taking months, but accelerated amid the election. However, the retrial was rescheduled after Election Day to June 18th, meaning that Lee remained eligible to run and appear on the ballot. Now, on the conservative side, the PPP was racked by conflict following the martial law declaration for obvious reasons. Two leading figures, Han Duck-soo, the former prime minister, and Kim Moon-soo, were expected to unify around a single candidate to challenge Lee. Han initially said he would not file his own candidacy until a unified ticket with Kim was agreed upon. However, negotiations quickly collapsed. Meetings on May 7th and May 8th failed to produce an agreement, and both men accused the other of sabotaging party unity. At one point, PPP floor leader Kwon Song-dong even launched a hunger strike to force unity, and the party briefly moved to cancel Kim's nomination in favor of Han. Those maneuvers were reversed after an emergency convention on May 10th, reinstating Kim as the PPP nominee. Tensions, however, peaked on May 11th when Han announced he was ending his campaign and would support Kim Moon-soo. Though he refused Kim's offer to serve as the campaign chair during this internal turmoil, former President Yoon Suk-yeol left the party altogether on May 17, 2025, and would end up endorsing Kim Moon-soo, attempting to consolidate his large conservative base. Now, while candidates battled for unity and credibility, the campaign's foreign policy debates did take an outsized prominence. Lee has been repeatedly framed by his opponents and some commentators as too soft on China, accused of wanting to recalibrate Seoul's foreign relations in a way that could distance South Korea from its alliance with the US and move towards a tilt tilt towards Beijing. During televised debates and party confrontations, conservative candidates like Kim Moon-soo argued that Lee's stances risked weakening the alliance and undermining systems like the THAAD missile defense, which had previously been central to US-Korean cooperation. These narratives did echo broader concerns within sections of South Korean politics and media that Lee's presidency might signal a strategic shift in the region's geopolitical alignment, which would remove South Korea from the southern triangle it was a part of with the US and Japan, while strengthening the northern triangle of China, Russia, and North Korea. Now, when the results came in on June 3rd, 2025, Lee Jae-myung was elected president in a high turnout vote. In his victory speech, Lee called the outcome a victory for the people and a victory for democracy. He pledged to serve all citizens and exercise presidential power for the welfare of the people after a period of deep domestic political uncertainty. Lee's inauguration on June 4, 2025 saw a bipartisan acknowledgement of his presidency. His first address emphasized dialogue, compromise, and national unity. In response to Yoon Suk-yeol, foreign reactions were immediate and politically charged. A White House official publicly stated that while South Korea had held a free and fair election, however, interestingly, the US also commented that it remained concerned and opposed to Chinese interference and influence in democracies around the world. These remarks are, of course, unusual in their early emphasis on China, without highlighting the US-Korean alliance first. However, analysts interpreted this as a cautionary message aimed at the new Lee administration, underscoring US anxieties about Seoul's new foreign policy trajectory and intensifying US-China competition. Seoul's foreign ministry, for its part, treated the US comments as unrelated to the election outcome itself, emphasizing that the alliance remained robust and that concerns over China should be viewed within the broader geopolitical context. Despite concerns warnings and overseas apprehensions, Lee's victory was certified as legitimate, as his presidency signaled a massive reactionary political shift to Yoon's martial law decree. Now, after the election, Yoon's criminal cases only continued. On July 6, 2025, prosecutors requested his detention following further questioning. Yoon was rearrested on July 10, 2025, indicted for abuse of power on July 19th, and denied release by the Seoul District Court on July 18th, resulting in continued detention for up to 6 months. On January 13th, 2026, in a historic and controversial moment, prosecutors formally sought the death penalty, calling Yoon's actions an unprecedented and grave act of constitutional destruction. While South Korea has maintained a moratorium on execution since 1997, the request, however, underscored the severity with which the state viewed Yoon's offense. Finally, and most recently, on February 19th, 2026, the court ruled that Yoon Suk-yeol had orchestrated an insurrection and attempted to undermine South Korea's constitutional system, sentencing him to life imprisonment. So until further notice, that is the end of our martial law story. However, Yoon was not the only one sentenced and found guilty. Among his large number of collaborators, equally destructive investigations and sentencings were levied against them. As of the filming of this video, here are all of the updates of each. Cho Ji-ho, the former Commissioner General of the National Police Agency, who facilitated the enforcement of martial law by mobilizing police units in support of military deployments around the National Assembly and other sensitive government sites, was arrested in December 2024 on charges related to insurrection and abuse of power. As of early 2026, Cho has been convicted on abuse of authority and insurrection-related charges and received 12 years in prison. Han Duck-soo, the former Prime Minister and acting president after Yoon's impeachment, was impeached by the National Assembly in December 2024 and subsequently indicted on charges related to abetting unconstitutional conduct. In early 2026, Han was convicted on charges of aiding insurrection and obstruction of a constitutional oversight and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kim Yong-hyun, the former Minister of National Defense, as well as a member of the Chungam faction, was one of the principal architects of the martial law operation. He recommended the declaration to Yoon, coordinated military deployments, and was linked to planning troop movement into the National Assembly and the National Election Commission facilities. He was arrested on December 8, 2024, and indicted on insurrection, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Kwak Jong-gun, a member of the Chungam faction as well, and the former commander of the Army Special Warfare Command, who commanded elite special forces units deployed near the National Assembly, was arrested and charged with participation in insurrection. He was convicted on charges related to military involvement in unconstitutional political activity. However, his sentence has not been finalized as of the filming of this video. Lee Jin-woo, who saw was the commander of the Capitol Defense, oversaw units responsible for security in Seoul, and his command was directly implicated in the movement of troops around the National Assembly complex and other government sites, creating the conditions possible for the legislative obstruction. He was arrested mid-December 2024 and convicted on charges of complicity in insurrection and abuse of authority, and as of this video, his case is still ongoing. Lee Sung-min, another member of the Chungam faction and former Minister of the Interior and Safety, oversaw police coordination and internal security during the crises. He was accused of failing to prevent unlawful deployments and helping normalize emergency rule within civilian administrative channels. He resigned December 2024 and was indicted on charges of negligence, abuse of authority, and complicity in unconstitutional acts, and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Park Un-soo, the former Chief of Staff of the Republic of Korea Army, was accused of transmitting or failing to resist unlawful orders from the Defense Ministry and Presidential Office regarding troop readiness and positioning during martial law. He was arrested December 2024. His case has not been finalized yet. Yo In-hyung, who was the commander of the Defense Counterintelligence, directly involved in surveillance planning and internal security measures related to martial law enforcement. His command prepared documents, operational plans for the emergency rule. He was arrested December 2024. However, his case has also not been finalized yet. But through these convictions and cases, the Korean legal state has ensured that every collaborator of Yoon is punished for their part in the martial law. Now, this sends a clear and unambiguous message to any other lawmakers or leaders considering wielding powerful executive force. Now, underscoring this entire video is the lingering question. After all the evidence is presented, why did Yoon declare martial law? Was Yoon actually sending a message, or is this a clear example of a coup attempt? Was Yoon wrong, or was he simply misunderstood? Because depending on how you answer those questions, you end up with two completely different interpretations of December 2024. There's a quote that I think of. Napoleon Bonaparte said that he who saves his country violates no law. And I think this quote in sum represents the central conflict of Yoon Suk-yeol. Now, if you believe Yoon acted primarily out of self-interest, simply to protect himself, his wife, his political survival, then martial law is mostly indefensible to the average person. It becomes an attempt to cling to power, and I think everything that followed looks like an overreach of power, even if he is ideologically aligned with conservatives. But if you take Yoon at his word that he believed the country was paralyzed, that the opposition had turned governance into complete obstruction, and then the institutions of Korea were breaking down, then the martial law declaration really stops looking like a coup attempt and starts looking like a dangerous, extreme, or not that extreme, but an attempt at preservation. There is good evidence to suggest this, at least that this is in part true. I don't necessarily buy either version on its own. To me, this obviously wasn't just a warning, but it also wasn't a fully thought out coup attempt. At least in the classic sense. Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law, for me, sits somewhere in between those two. Now, Yoon clearly wanted to exercise strong executive power. He wanted to shock the Korean political system. He wanted to remind everyone that the presidency still had teeth. However, the planning of this was sloppy, the execution was extremely chaotic, and the political calculation was disastrous for him and his own party. Yoon did arguably much more harm than good to the country and his supporters than benefit. The PPP is completely fractured now. And I think if any of this feels familiar, it probably should. I think it would be foolish not to pay attention to the obvious parallels to January 6th in the US and the broader Trump movement at large. In both cases, you have conservative leaders who feel boxed in by institutions, courts, media, and legislatures, start seeing these institutions as operating outside of the scope of their intended purpose. And in both of these cases, when things cross a line, the state responded with prosecutions, indictments, and what a lot of people, myself included, would fairly describe as lawfare. There's also an international dimension to this that people I don't think are really talking about. Now, something to note is in the months leading up to and following the martial law, Yoon and figures around him were clearly positioning themselves closer to Trump-aligned networks in the US. The conservative elites in Korea were watching the American election extremely closely, and according to multiple reports, you can look this up, they were betting that a Trump return would shift the international climate in their favor. Something that's interesting is on December December 14th, 2024, just days after the martial law declaration, Yoon Suk-yeol met with Matt Schlapp. For those of you who don't know, he's a close Trump ally and the head of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee. Now, we don't know the full contents of that meeting, but the timing alone is pretty hard to ignore, in my opinion. It obviously was not just like a neutral diplomatic exchange. Matt Schlapp is there acting as a representative, and Yoon was obviously betting hard on Trump's imminent return to power. To me, this was a clear attempt to build an ideological alignment with another movement that's openly hostile to what it also sees as liberal institutional overreach. And that does matter, especially when you look at what happened next. Yoon's sentencing, his life sentence included, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You know, South Korea is still deeply embedded in an alliance system where the American pressure overrides Korean domestic power. And one of the major reasons that South Korean dictators existed for as long as they did, even after democracy was established in the country, was because the US allowed it. It's possible a future Trump administration could, in theory, pressure the Lee Jae-myung government behind closed doors to soften the handling of, well, Yoon's cases or other cases of his allies. Now, that doesn't mean a pardon is likely or even realistic, at least not until another conservative president returns to power in Korea. But the idea that US politics has no influence on how this ultimately plays out in Korea is naive. Korea's legal system is sovereign, but like I said, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It doesn't mean all the charges against Yoon are fake and that nobody committed any crimes, but it does mean the Korean legal system is being used to send a clear message. This line cannot be crossed. After Yoon's martial law declaration, the National Assembly amended how martial laws could even be enacted in the country. They amended the Constitution. And this sets a new precedent going forward. Now, I also want to talk about my experience with martial law. You know, I was in Korea when martial law happened, and on a personal day-to-day level, like as someone on a student visa like myself, it didn't feel like the country had like suddenly collapsed into chaos. I mean, I'm still here. You know, it happened late at night. It only lasted like 6 hours. You could feel tension in the air. You know, people were on their phones and social media was blowing up. But, you know, like I still went to class the next day. Subway still ran. I went to cafes. You know, life didn't stop, I guess is the point I'm making. And so I just think that's something that's really important to note, because the martial law was primarily a government crisis. It wasn't like a mass social breakdown where everyday life like totally unravels for everybody. You know, the flashpoint was around the National Assembly. You know, it wasn't in neighborhoods and cities and places of public life. And so the real consequences unfolded politically in South Korea and legally, you know, over the following months, not in the streets that night. You know, like I don't think the people's protests had any effect on the martial law. That being said, it doesn't make it less serious or it doesn't diminish the effects of the martial law, but it does matter for how we understand, you know, what kind of crisis this actually was. You know, a lot of the legal reasoning used to declare Yoon's martial law illegal rests on like procedural failures, you know, not properly notifying the cabinet, not following formal steps, not meeting technical requirements. Now, to me, these are secondary issues. You know, I mean, they're not meaningless, but they're not the core issue either. I mean, if you believe martial law was justified, then whether the paperwork or procedure was followed correctly doesn't suddenly make it illegitimate in principle. You know, the procedure's often forgotten in politics. But the court also ruled, interestingly, that martial law requires a true emergency, and that the legislative obstruction by the opposition did not qualify as such emergency. You know, but that judgment isn't objective in a certain sense. It is a political judgment made by a court that exists inside Korea's political ecosystem. You know, we know that courts aren't neutral. We see our Supreme Court. They interpret what counts as an emergency based on their own worldview. You can accept the ruling legally and still question whether their definition of emergency is politically charged. There's also the election integrity angle, something I haven't brought up a ton, which is sort of crucial to the justification that Yoon makes. You know, there are legitimate election integrity concerns in South Korea. You know, and whether you think those concerns rise to the level of emergency is debatable, but I don't think it's crazy to argue that election legitimacy is foundational to a state's stability. These are the same arguments we've heard from Trump and co. following the 2020 election and his subsequent charges. If a president genuinely believes that the elections are compromised, then from their perspective, that is a national emergency. And so this complicates the narrative that this was like pure delusion or some sort of like, you know, insane power grab, power hunger. At the same time, this is where also, you know, Yoon loses a lot of ground, because on top of this, according to reporting and testimony, Yoon was allegedly willing to provoke North Korea, which included sending drones across the border to manufacture a crisis atmosphere that could justify emergency powers. So if this is true, and the evidence leans towards it being so, that, in my opinion, is like dangerous overreach. You know, while North Korea is small and underdeveloped, it's still a nuclear armed state. South Korea has no nukes. You know, so manufacturing tension with them to create political leverage at home is objectively irresponsible in my opinion. And that easily could have spiraled into something far worse. So what is like my ultimate position on the martial law declaration? I'm torn. On the one hand, I do believe Yoon was acting out of desperation, and he saw the martial law as his only method to enact real change for the betterment of South Korea. However, the reports of creating a military conflict with North Korea and dubious reports of election fraud lead me to believe he acted rashly and impulsively. You know, I don't think this was like a clean, heroic act of national like salvation, but I also don't think it was like a cartoon villain, evil dictator-esque coup. You know, I do lean towards the former if I'm forced to choose. Ultimately, it was a reckless move, you know, rooted in probably a genuine political frustration, paranoia. You know, it wasn't born in a vacuum. In my opinion, the opposition, the DPK, is as much as fault for this declaration of martial law as Yoon is. You know, and pretending they're not, I don't think that helps anyone understand why it happened or, you know, why similar moments keep popping up in South Korea and other parts of the world. So, you know, I think under these same sort of conditions is how we got like the reign of Trump in the US. And so that's sort of where I land on Yoon and the martial law. If you've made it this far, I do just want to thank you for watching. You know, I know this was like a really long video, but I felt that the story deserved more than just like headlines. And as someone so invested in Korean politics, I did want to do the event justice. You know, I felt it deserved that from someone who experienced it. If you're interested in this and more content, please check out some of my other videos. I've got way more coming on a variety of topics. If you like this video, you know, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the subject. You know, did I get anything wrong? And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.